My name is Gerald Henderson. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people feel comfortable overlooking. Not ignored exactly, just underestimated. I've spent years working in environments where being dependable mattered more than being visible. Where showing up early, staying late, and keeping things running smoothly became my quiet reputation. I wasn't loud, I wasn't political, I didn't play the kind of games that draw attention. And because of that, people often assumed they understood me completely. They didn't. This story isn't about revenge, it's not about humiliation, or shouting matches, or some dramatic moment where everything explodes. It's about pressure, the kind that builds slowly, the kind that wears you down not with cruelty, but with plausible deniability, with jokes that go a second too long, with expectations that quietly shift, with lines that blur just enough that you start questioning your own instincts. For over a year, I lived inside that pressure. I was sidelined, subtly, targeted indirectly, and all the while I was being spoken to in a way that never quite crossed the line, until it did. But when it did, it happened privately, in messages no one else saw, words that were flirtatious enough to be deniable, personal enough to be inappropriate, and calculated enough to create imbalance. And here's the part that matters. I didn't react the way people expect these stories to go. I didn't confront. I didn't threaten. I didn't vent to coworkers or post anything online. I didn't even let myself believe at first that what was happening could ever become leverage. Instead, I stayed observant. What you'll hear over the course of this story is not a tale of sudden courage or lucky timing. It's the slow unfolding of awareness, of realizing that silence can be passive or it can be intentional. Understanding that power doesn't always come from escalation. Sometimes it comes from documentation, from patience, from letting someone assume you're harmless while they leave a trail they never think you'll keep. There's no villain monologue here, no triumphant soundtrack moment. What there is a psychological reversal that happened quietly, almost invisibly, until it was irreversible. I'm sharing this not to make myself look clever or strong, but because stories like this usually get told in extremes. And real life rarely works that way. Real life is subtle, uncomfortable, complicated, and often justice doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives calmly, with receipts. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever stayed quiet, not because you were weak, but because you were watching, if you've ever wondered whether keeping proof instead of making noise was the right choice, then this story might feel familiar. Let me ask you something. Before we go any further, have you ever sensed that someone believed you'd never push back and felt that quiet moment when you realized they were wrong? To them, I was reliable. That's the word people used most often when they spoke about me. Sometimes to my face, more often not. Reliable, steady, solid. The kind of person you could hand something to and forget about. Confident it would be done correctly. On time, without fuss. In meetings, I was the one who filled in gaps when others glossed over details. I caught errors before they became problems. I stayed after calls ended to make sure deliverables were aligned. When deadlines tightened, my name appeared quietly on the task list. Not because I volunteered loudly, but because everyone assumed I would handle it. And I did. What I didn't do was posture. I didn't compete for airtime. I didn't perform with confidence theatrically. I wasn't the sharp-elbowed climber or the charismatic presence people remembered after the room emptied. I spoke when I had something precise to add, then went back to listening. That made people comfortable around me, comfortable enough to forget I was paying attention. In the social ecosystem of the office, roles form quickly. Some people are seen as future leaders. Others are innovators. A few as liabilities. And then there are people like I was. Infrastructure, useful, dependable, emotionally neutral. Someone whose competence made other people's days easier without demanding recognition. No one worried about how I felt. And I learned early that if you don't demand attention, people will fill in the blanks for you. They'll decide you're content, that you're unambitious, that you're harmless, especially if you're calm, especially if you don't react. My boss, I'll call him Daniel, fit neatly into that assumption. He was polished, socially fluent, and admired by upper management. The kind of man who could deliver pressure with a smile and plausibly deny it later. To him, I was his guy, the dependable one, the safe pair of hands, the one who wouldn't cause trouble. And at first, that role didn't feel dangerous, it felt practical. I had a mortgage, a routine, a preference for stability over noise. I believed that if I did my work well and kept my head down, things would remain fair enough. But fairness doesn't erode loudly. It erodes in tone, in timing, in what's said privately versus publicly. Back then, I didn't frame it as being sidelined. I told myself I simply wasn't interested in the spotlight. When projects I helped build were presented without my name attached, I shrugged it off. When credit flowed upward instead of outward, I rationalized it as hierarchy. When Daniel joked about my loyalty in front of others, I smiled politely. People often confuse politeness with passivity. What they didn't see, what no one ever seems to notice, is that being quiet doesn't mean being unaware. I watched how decisions were framed, who was protected, who was tested, who could cross lines and call it charm. I noticed how expectations shifted subtly, how availability turned into obligation, how just this once became routine. And still, to them, I was the same thing I'd always been. The man who wouldn't push back. The man who wouldn't document. The man who wouldn't remember. The man who wouldn't ever turn the mirror around. They thought I was invisible because I didn't insist on being seen. They were wrong about why I stayed quiet. At the time, even I didn't fully understand it yet. I thought silence was simply my nature. That endurance was a virtue. That keeping things smooth mattered more than asserting myself. What I didn't realize, what would only become clear much later, was that the role they assigned me was never neutral. It was strategic. And the moment you accept a role without question, someone else starts writing your limits for you. The first moment didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic pause, no sharp intake of breath, no instant recognition that something had shifted. It arrived the way most meaningful changes do, quietly, almost politely, wrapped in language that could be dismissed if you tried hard enough. It happened late one afternoon, after most of the office had thinned out. The kind of hour where conversations soften and professionalism loosens just a fraction. Daniel stopped by my desk under the pretense of clarifying a report I'd submitted earlier that day. He didn't sit, he leaned. That detail stuck with me later, though at the time it registered only as mild discomfort. He skimmed the document on my screen, nodded along, then smiled in a way that felt slightly out of place for the context. "You always make things easier," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." On its own, that sentence was harmless, complimentary even. I'd heard versions of it before. I thanked him, closed the file, and expected the moment to end there. It didn't. Instead, he added casually, "You know, if everyone were as attentive as you, my life would be a lot simpler." There was a pause after that, just long enough to feel deliberate. I laughed lightly, not because it was funny, but because laughter smooths things over. It signals ease, it prevents questions. I'd learned that reflex early in my career. Daniel chuckled too, then glanced at his phone. "Anyway," he said, straightening up, "keep being you." He walked away, leaving behind a faint sense of unease I couldn't quite justify. That was the cut. Not because of what he said, but because of how it landed. The comment lived in the grey space. Too personal to be purely professional, too mild to challenge without sounding paranoid. If I mentioned it to someone else, I knew exactly how it would sound. He was just being nice, you're reading into it, that's just his style. So I filed it away instead. Over the next few days, nothing overt followed. No escalation, no repeat. And that made it easier to convince myself it hadn't mattered. I focused on work, on deliverables, on the familiar rhythm of staying useful. But something had shifted internally. I started noticing Daniel's tone more closely. How his compliments were reserved for private moments, never meetings. How his praise felt less like recognition and more like ownership. As if my competence was something he could reference when it suited him. Then came the message. It arrived on a Sunday evening just after 8. A Slack notification, unexpected but not unheard of. I opened it without thinking. "Hope I'm not bothering you," he wrote. "Just wanted to say I really appreciate how dedicated you are." Not many people bring that kind of energy. Again, nothing overt, nothing actionable, but the timing mattered, the intimacy of a weekend message, the framing of energy, a word that didn't belong in a performance review. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. I typed a brief, neutral reply, thanked him, closed the app. That night I found myself replaying both moments, the desk side comment, the message, searching for certainty. Was this something, or was I manufacturing meaning where there was none? The office has a way of teaching you to doubt your instincts, especially when the line hasn't been crossed clearly, especially when the person on the other side holds power over your role, your evaluations, your future. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I didn't confront him. I didn't document anything formally. I didn't even name the discomfort out loud. I told myself it was easier to let small things pass than to risk being labeled difficult. But here's what I didn't understand yet. Small cuts don't hurt because of their size. They hurt because they test how much you'll tolerate. And once someone learns you'll absorb a little discomfort without resistance, they don't stop there. They adjust. Incrementally. Carefully. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. That moment at my desk wasn't a compliment. It was a calibration, a way of seeing how I would respond when the tone shifted just enough to notice, but not enough to challenge, and my response told him everything he needed to know. Once the first boundary holds, people rarely announce that they're testing the next one. They just move it, slowly enough that you don't feel the shift in real time, subtly enough that when you finally look back, the distance feels shocking, but the individual steps feel defensible. That's how it went with Daniel. After that initial message, communication became more frequent, but never overtly inappropriate. Comments about work were occasionally paired with observations about my demeanor, my calm presence, my grounding effect, always phrased like appreciation, always delivered privately, and always just personal enough to make me pause. If this had happened once or twice, I might have dismissed it entirely. But repetition does something strange to perception. It normalizes what should stay occasional. It makes the unusual feel routine. A late-night message after a long week. A compliment slipped into a performance check-in. A joking remark about how I never get flustered, delivered with a look that lingered half a second too long. None of it crossed a clear line. That was the point. The genius of plausible deniability is that it turns discomfort into a burden the recipient must carry alone. If you speak up too early, you look reactive. If you wait too long, you're asked why you didn't say something sooner. So I stayed where many people stay, in the middle, quietly rationalizing. I told myself that Daniel was socially awkward in his own way, that this was his version of encouragement, that intent mattered more than impact. And there was another factor, one that kept me silent longer than I like to admit. I was being sidelined at the same time. Not abruptly, not obviously, but steadily. Projects I had historically led were reassigned without explanation. I was looped in later on decisions I'd once shaped from the beginning. My role shifted from contributor to executor. When I asked clarifying questions, the answers were vague. We're just trying something new. Leadership wants a different voice on this. It's nothing personal, and maybe it wasn't, on paper. But paired with the increasingly personal tone of Daniel's messages, it created a dissonance I couldn't ignore. Publicly, I was being diminished. Privately, I was being singled out. That combination is destabilizing by design. It makes you doubt your footing. Makes you question whether pushing back would cost you even more ground. Makes you wonder if staying agreeable is the safer option. So I stayed agreeable. I responded politely, briefly, professionally. I never mirrored his tone, never escalated, never invited familiarity. I assumed that neutrality would discourage further drift. It didn't. What it did instead was teach him that I wouldn't object. And that's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through unanswered behavior. Around that time, a colleague casually mentioned how lucky I was to have Daniel's support. "He really trusts you," she said. "You're clearly one of his favorites." The word made my stomach tighten. Favorites. I smiled and deflected, but the comment lingered, because from the outside, that's exactly how it looked. Private praise, frequent check-ins, a sense of closeness. No one saw the imbalance. No one saw how being favored without visibility or advancement is just another form of control. I started sleeping poorly. Not because anything dramatic was happening, but because my mind kept circling the same questions. If I spoke up, what would I even say? If I stayed silent, what was I allowing to continue? And at what point does endurance become consent? The hardest part was that nothing in my rational mind screamed a danger. There were no threats, no explicit comments, no witnesses, just a slow accumulation of moments that felt increasingly misaligned with the professional environment I thought I was in. So I adjusted instead of confronting. I became more careful with my words, more neutral in tone. I stopped replying outside work hours. I kept conversations strictly task-focused. And when Daniel commented on the shift, "You've gotten quieter lately," I smiled and blamed the workload. That answer seemed to satisfy him. But internally, something had changed. I'd stopped assuming the situation would self-correct. I'd started noticing patterns. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that by staying silent, I wasn't just enduring disrespect. I was giving it time to document itself. Roles solidify quietly. No one ever sits you down and explains the part they've cast you in. They just start responding to you as if it's already agreed upon. And if you don't challenge it early, the role becomes reality. By the time I recognized mine, it had already settled into place. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed pressure without redirecting it. The person who made other people's decisions look cleaner than they were. When something went wrong, I was asked to take a look. When something succeeded, it was framed as great leadership. I didn't protest, not because I didn't notice, but because I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. It rarely does. Daniel relied on me in ways that weren't visible upward. He asked me to sanity check proposals before they reached executives, to rework timelines quietly when expectations were unrealistic, to step in when another team dropped the ball without fanfare. "You're good at smoothing things out," he told me once. "You don't make things messy." At the time, I took that as a compliment. Only later did I understand it as a description of what he expected me to remain. Invisible competence is a dangerous thing. It makes you indispensable and expendable at the same time. And alongside that professional role, another expectation had taken shape, one I hadn't agreed to, but had failed to reject forcefully enough. I was supposed to be emotionally accommodating. When Daniel's messages drifted slightly personal, I was expected to absorb it with grace. When his tone shifted from managerial to familiar, I was supposed to interpret it charitably. When he tested proximity, lingering conversations, subtle comments about how easy I was to talk to, I was meant to stay unreactive, because that's what stabilizers do. They don't disrupt, they don't accuse, they don't make situations uncomfortable for people with more power than they have. I remember one meeting in particular, a quarterly review where a project I had essentially rebuilt from the ground up was presented by someone else. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. I sat there listening, taking notes, nodding at the right moments. Daniel caught my eye briefly and gave a small, knowing smile, as if to say, "You understand how this works." And I did, or at least I thought I did. Afterward, he sent me a message. "Couldn't have done that without you. I hope you know that." That was the role in a single sentence. You matter, but only privately. You contribute, but without credit. You're valued, but not visibly. And because I didn't challenge it, the role hardened. I became the person things were done through, not the person things were done with. The buffer, the filter, the quiet fix. What I didn't realize then was that the more consistently you accept a role, the more people rely on it to stay unchanged. And the moment you threaten it, even by setting boundaries, it feels to them like betrayal. That's why I felt trapped. If I spoke up about the sidelining, I risked being seen as resentful. If I addressed the messages, I risked being seen as dramatic. If I did both, I risked being reframed as the problem. So I stayed where I was expected to stay, but something inside me had shifted. Not in anger, not in fear, but in clarity. I stopped asking myself whether Daniel meant anything by his behavior. I started asking whether the role I'd been placed in was sustainable, because a role that depends on your silence is never neutral. It's extractive. And once you understand that, the question stops being, should I endure this? It becomes, what happens if I don't? That was the moment I realized. The role I'd been assigned wasn't about trust or appreciation. It was about control. And control only works when both people agree to the script. I was quietly rewriting mine. The shift didn't come with confrontation. There was no raised voice, no email drafted and deleted, no dramatic walkout or ultimatum rehearsed in my head. In fact, the day everything changed looked unremarkable from the outside. That's what made it so decisive. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of day that blends into the rest of the calendar if nothing disrupts it. I was reviewing a revised scope document, one I'd already corrected twice, when Daniel messaged me again. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. "Just wanted your thoughts. Off the record." I remember that phrase clearly. Off the record. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was busy, but because something in me paused. A quiet, internal hesitation I'd learned to listen to over the years. I asked him to send over what he wanted reviewed. Instead, he suggested we talk later, in person. That alone wasn't unusual. But paired with the phrasing, it created a sense of expectation that felt misplaced. I agreed neutrally and went back to my work. When he stopped by my desk that afternoon, his tone was relaxed, almost conspiratorial. He pulled up a chair without asking and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I won't take long," he said. "I just appreciate having someone I can speak freely with." There it was again, that familiar framing. I listened as he spoke about pressures from above, frustrations with other team leads, and the difficulty of managing personalities. It was a monologue I'd heard variations of before. And as always, I offered measured responses, practical insights, calm acknowledgement. Then he smiled and said, "You're different, you know that. You don't get rattled. It's refreshing." This time I didn't smile back. I didn't frown either. I simply let the silence sit. It was brief, only a few seconds, but it altered the rhythm of the conversation. Daniel noticed. His posture shifted slightly. He continued talking, but the ease had changed. That moment, that tiny decision not to smooth over the silence, was the shift. Because in that pause, something became clear to me with uncomfortable precision. This wasn't mentorship. It wasn't camaraderie. It wasn't appreciation. It was positioning. He was using proximity and praise to create a sense of exclusivity without accountability. A private channel where lines could blur while public dynamics stayed unchanged. And for the first time, I saw my silence not as restraint, but as participation. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my continued accommodation was allowing a dynamic I didn't consent to consciously. The conversation ended shortly after. Nothing dramatic was said. No line was crossed overtly. Daniel stood, thanked me, and walked away. But I didn't return to my work immediately. I sat there, hands resting on the desk, staring at the screen without seeing it. The realization wasn't angry. It wasn't even emotional in the way people expect. It was sober, almost clinical. If this continued, it would not resolve itself. If I confronted him emotionally, I'd lose leverage. If I stayed silent unconsciously, the role would calcify further. So I made a different choice. I decided that silence from that moment on would be intentional. Not avoidance, not fear, not politeness. Strategy. That evening when I got home, I opened the slim black notebook I'd carried for years, usually filled with meeting notes and timelines, and turned to a fresh page. I wrote the date. Then calmly, without embellishment, I wrote down what had happened, the words used, the tone, the context. No interpretation, just facts. It felt oddly grounding, not empowering in a dramatic sense, but stabilizing, as if I'd finally anchored something that had been floating uncomfortably between doubt and instinct. Over the next few days, I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I remained professional, responsive, neutral. But internally, the lens had shifted. Every interaction was now observed with clarity instead of confusion. Every message is evaluated not for intent, but for pattern, for alignment with policy, with boundaries, with professional norms. I wasn't waiting for something to happen anymore. I was watching, and the quietest part of all, the part that surprised me most, was the absence of fear. Once you name a situation accurately, it loses its power to disorient you. From that day forward, I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew I wouldn't be improvising my response. There's a difference between being quiet because you're unsure and being quiet because you're deliberate. From the outside, nothing about me changed. I still showed up on time, still delivered clean work, still responded to messages promptly and professionally. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have said I'd become even more efficient. But internally, the shift was absolute. I no longer wondered what Daniel meant. I no longer questioned whether I was overthinking. I no longer debated if this would simply fade on its own. Silence now had a purpose. I stopped offering emotional cushioning. When Daniel vented, I acknowledged without validating. When his tone leaned familiar, I responded with clarity instead of warmth. I didn't push him away, but I didn't meet him halfway either. And that unsettled him, not overtly, not enough to comment on, but I could sense it in the micro adjustments, shorter messages, slightly more formal phrasing, a subtle recalibration of distance. People notice when the dynamic changes, even if they don't understand why. Around this time, I began saving everything, not obsessively, not reactively, methodically. Emails were archived, messages exported, dates noted, context preserved. I didn't edit. I didn't annotate emotionally. I treated it like a record, not a case. Because cases are built on interpretation. Records are built on facts. What surprised me was how quickly the material accumulated once I started paying attention. Not because Daniel escalated, but because he'd already normalized behavior he assumed would remain unseen. There were messages that commented on my demeanor, on how easy I was to talk to, on how he valued our private clarity compared to group discussions. Nothing obscene, nothing explicit, but everything inappropriate in aggregate. And that's something most people misunderstand about professional boundaries. It's not one dramatic line crossing that matters. It's the repeated erosion that creates imbalance. As I documented, I also started educating myself quietly. I read internal policies, not skimming, but studying language. I learned how terms like conduct, professionalism, and power imbalance were defined. I paid attention to what was explicitly prohibited and what was discouraged through pattern rather than example. I didn't assume protection. I assumed the process. At the same time, I noticed something else. The sidelining continued. I was no longer invited to early stage discussions. Decisions arrived fully formed. My role became execution only. And yet Daniel's private messages retained their familiarity, as if he believed the personal channel compensated for the professional narrowing. That contradiction clarified everything. The less visible I became publicly, the more he seemed to value my private availability. It wasn't malicious in the cartoon sense. It was convenient, comfortable, unchallenged. Until it wasn't. One evening he sent a message that stood out. Not because of its content, but because of its assumption. "You always understand where I'm coming from," he wrote. "That's rare." I didn't reply right away. I saved it. Then I responded with a single line. "Happy to help with work-related questions." Neutral, unemotional, precise. After that, the tone shifted again. Not aggressively, more cautiously. As if he were testing whether the channel still functioned the way he expected. That's when I understood something crucial. He wasn't worried about crossing a line. He was worried about losing access. And access is power. By choosing silence strategically, I wasn't withdrawing. I was redefining the terms. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I wasn't escalating. I was letting his own words exist without insulation. What people often miss is that silence, when chosen consciously, forces others to reveal themselves. They either adjust respectfully, or they expose patterns they assumed would remain private. Daniel did the latter. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. And the more he adjusted, the clearer it became that my quiet wasn't being interpreted as weakness anymore. It was being interpreted as unknown. And uncertainty makes people careless. By the end of that period, I wasn't waiting for an apology or a confrontation. I was waiting for completion. Because once you've gathered enough truth, you don't need noise. You just need timing. What people rarely notice about quiet individuals is how much time they spend preparing. Not plotting, not fantasizing about outcomes, just observing, learning, and positioning while everyone else assumes nothing is happening. Because when you're not loud, people stop guarding their behavior around you. That was the advantage Daniel never accounted for. While he recalibrated his tone in small ways, I continued documenting consistently, unemotionally. I didn't only save messages that made me uncomfortable, I saved everything. Context matters, sequences matter, silence between messages matters. Patterns are only visible when you preserve the whole picture. I created a system, simple, secure, redundant. Dates, platforms, exact wording, no commentary, no assumptions. I treated it the way I treated work problems. Break it down, remove emotion, understand structure. At the same time, I paid attention to the environment. Who had access to what information? How decisions moved upward? Which departments intersected with compliance and HR? Not as people, but as processes. As Buzz, this wasn't about going to HR impulsively. It was about understanding how institutions respond when presented with complete, chronological, verifiable information. I learned which policies were aspirational and which were enforceable, which language triggered mandatory review, which phrasing mattered legally, not emotionally. And here's the part no one noticed. I never changed my demeanor. I didn't become cold. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't hint at discomfort. I didn't signal preparation. I stayed the same reliable presence I'd always been. Because the moment people sense preparation, they adjust their behavior. I needed authenticity. What Daniel also didn't notice was how my silence changed his behavior in ways that helped me. As I became more reserved, he filled the space. When reassurance disappeared, he compensated with an explanation. When warmth wasn't mirrored, he clarified intentions, often in writing. Each clarification added another layer of record. There was one message in particular that stood out, not because it was egregious, but because it summarized the dynamic perfectly. "You're easy to talk to," he wrote. "I don't have to be as careful with you." That line didn't make me angry. It made me certain. Carefulness exists for a reason, and the absence of it, especially across a power imbalance, isn't intimacy. It's entitlement. I archived the message and moved on. Around that time, I began quietly preparing for contingencies. Not dramatic exits, just optionality. I updated my CV, reconnected with former colleagues, took a short course on regulatory compliance, not because I needed it for my role, but because understanding the framework matters when leverage appears. All of it was invisible. To the office, I was still the same Gerald, still dependable, still unassuming, still someone who would never cause trouble. That assumption became the foundation of their blind spot. People don't expect preparation from those they underestimate. They expect endurance, compliance, silence without strategy. And that's the mistake, because preparation doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. By the time you notice it, it's already finished. What I was building wasn't a case, it was clarity about what had happened, about how it fit policy, about what outcomes were possible. I didn't fantasize about consequences. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine vindication. I focused on one question. If I needed to protect myself tomorrow, would I have everything I needed? Eventually, the answer became yes. And when it did, something unexpected happened. The pressure I'd been carrying for months lifted. Not because the situation had resolved, but because I was no longer vulnerable to confusion or doubt. I knew exactly what had occurred. I knew exactly how it could be framed. And I knew exactly how little noise would be required. What Daniel never noticed was that while he believed I was passive, I had become precise. And precision, once achieved, doesn't rush. It waits. The moment of revelation didn't feel triumphant. There was no surge of adrenaline, no satisfaction, no urge to tell anyone what I'd discovered. It arrived quietly, almost mundanely, during an evening I had intended to spend doing nothing more than clearing my inbox. I was reviewing saved files, not searching for anything specific, just checking that everything was properly archived, dates aligned, conversations intact, no gaps, no edits. That's when I saw it. Not a single message, but a sequence. Individually, each interaction was defensible. Compliments framed as appreciation. Familiarity masked as trust. Private communication is justified as efficient. But together, laid out chronologically, stripped of context, excuses, they form something unmistakable. A pattern of personalized attention, a consistent private channel, a repeated narrowing of professional distance, all initiated from a position of authority, all undocumented anywhere but my records. And then there was the asymmetry. At the same time these messages were sent, my professional visibility had decreased. Responsibilities were removed quietly. Credit rerouted upward. Influence reduced. That combination, private familiarity paired with public marginalization, wasn't ambiguous anymore. It was leverage, not because it was scandalous, but it was indefensible when framed correctly. I sat back and let that realization settle, not emotionally, but intellectually. I asked myself the only questions that mattered. Was this a misunderstanding? No. The repetition ruled that out. Was this mutual? No. My responses were consistently neutral. Was this documented? Yes, completely. Would it stand on its own without interpretation? Yes. That was the key. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt clear. Clarity is different. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't demand action. It simply removes confusion from the equation. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't wondering what might happen. I was choosing whether anything should happen at all. That night, I didn't draft emails. I didn't rehearse explanations. I didn't even decide on a course of action. Instead, I did something far more important. I stopped reacting internally. The constant low-grade vigilance, the scanning of tone, the second-guessing, the self-monitoring, it all went quiet. Because leverage, when real, doesn't need to be used to be effective. Its existence alone changes how you carry yourself. Over the next few weeks, I observed Daniel more closely, not with anxiety, but with distance. His behavior made more sense now. The subtle entitlement, the assumption of access, the mild surprise when I maintained boundaries. He wasn't reckless. He was comfortable. Comfortable people don't imagine consequences. And that's when another realization surfaced, one that shaped everything that followed. I didn't owe him a confrontation. I didn't owe the company drama. I didn't even owe myself vindication. What I owed myself was protection. The question wasn't, how do I expose this? It was, when, if ever, does this need to be revealed? That distinction mattered, because exposure is emotional. Protection is strategic. I reviewed company policy again, not to find violations, but to understand thresholds. When does reporting become mandatory? When does knowledge create obligation? When does silence stop being neutral? I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I was deciding what I was willing to tolerate going forward, and what conditions would trigger action. And quietly, something else shifted. Daniel began to sense the change. Not the records, not the leverage, the certainty. I no longer hesitated in conversations. I didn't seek reassurance. I didn't fill the silences. I didn't explain myself unnecessarily. And that unsettled him far more than any accusation would have. People who rely on ambiguity lose their footing when someone stops being confused. One afternoon, he asked me, casually, if everything was still good between us. I looked at him and said calmly, "Work is fine. Nothing more. No reassurance, no warmth, no invitation." The conversation moved on, but the dynamic didn't recover. Because what he never realized, what he couldn't see, was that I had already crossed the most important threshold. I no longer needed his approval. I no longer feared his perception. And I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The leverage existed whether I used it or not. And once you understand that, the power dynamic reverses quietly. The reveal wasn't public. It was internal, and it changed everything. Clarity eventually demands a decision. Not immediately, not impulsively, but inevitably. Once I understood what I had, and what it meant, I couldn't pretend I was still weighing possibilities in the abstract. The situation had moved from uncertainty to choice, and choice always carries responsibility. I had options, real ones. I could continue as I was, silent, protected by documentation, letting the dynamic exist without escalation. That path offered stability, at least temporarily. As long as Daniel didn't push further, I could remain where I was, shield intact, leverage unused. I could request a transfer, frame it as professional growth, remove myself from proximity, and close the chapter quietly. That option appealed to the part of me that values clean endings. Or I could act, not emotionally, not publicly, but decisively. Each option had consequences. Doing nothing meant accepting the role indefinitely. Even with leverage, silence can become complicity if it allows harm to persist, especially when power imbalance remains unaddressed. Leaving quietly meant safety, but also meant the pattern would likely repeat with someone else. That knowledge weighed on me more than I expected. Acting meant risk, not because the facts weren't solid, but because systems are imperfect, because escalation changes how you're seen, because once something is set in motion, it doesn't belong to you anymore. I didn't rush the choice. For weeks, I observed. I tested nothing. I provoked nothing. I simply paid attention to whether the dynamic corrected itself now that my boundaries were clear. It didn't. Daniel became more cautious, but not more respectful. The private channel remained. The sidelining continued. The assumption that things would eventually return to normal lingered. That told me everything. Change wasn't coming organically. So I asked myself one final question, one that cut through every rationalization. If nothing changes, can I live with this version of myself a year from now? The answer was immediate. No, not because I needed justice, not because I wanted consequences, but because remaining silent now would no longer be strategic. It would be a surrender. The decision I made wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. And it wasn't irreversible in the way people imagine. It was procedural. I prepared a summary, not a narrative, just a timeline. Dates, platforms, direct quotes, context stripped to essentials, no adjectives, no speculation. I reviewed it once, then again. I asked myself whether I would stand by every line if questioned under scrutiny. I could. That mattered. I didn't send it yet. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with compliance, not HR. A quiet channel, a neutral entry point. I framed it not as a complaint, but as a request for guidance regarding documentation I'd retained and boundaries I'd attempted to establish. That framing was intentional. I wasn't accusing. I was disclosing. The difference is subtle, but critical. Accusations invite defense. Disclosures invite process. The meeting was set for the following week. Until then, nothing changed outwardly. I continued working, continued responding, continued existing in the same space with the same people who had no idea a decision had already been made. That's the strange thing about decision points. From the outside, everything looks the same. But internally, the weight shifts. Once you choose the irreversible path, not because it's aggressive, but because it's honest, there's a calm that settles in. I wasn't anxious about the outcome. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I wasn't hoping for validation. I was simply ready to let facts exist where they belonged, ready to stop carrying something that was never mine to manage alone, and ready to accept whatever consequences came, not as punishment, but as closure. The decision wasn't about winning. It was about ending the imbalance. And once that choice is made, silence stops being a protection. It becomes a transition. The days leading up to the meeting passed without incident. That in itself felt strange. When people imagine pivotal moments, they expect tension to spike, emails to sharpen, glances to linger, intuition to scream that something is about to happen. But real shifts don't announce themselves that way. They move quietly. I didn't change my routine. I didn't withdraw. I didn't suddenly become distant or guarded. If anything, I became more precise, clearer in meetings, more concise in writing, less inclined to over-explain. Precision creates distance without hostility. Daniel noticed, though he couldn't name it. He checked in more often, but with safer language. Asked about workloads, referenced alignment. The messages were careful now. Professional, measured, almost rehearsed. That told me something important. He sensed the loss of informal access. He didn't yet sense the reason. That's the window where action matters. The meeting with compliance took place midweek. A small room, neutral tone, no urgency. Exactly how I'd hoped it would be framed. I didn't dramatize. I didn't tell a story. I presented the timeline. I explained the pattern, the imbalance, the steps I'd taken to set boundaries quietly. I emphasized that my goal wasn't accusation, but clarity, understanding whether what I documented fell within acceptable conduct and what my obligations were now that I had it. The officer listened without interrupting. That silence felt different from Daniel's. This was procedural silence, analytical, focused. When she finally spoke, she didn't offer comfort or alarm. She said one sentence that confirmed everything I needed to know. Thank you for bringing this forward in this format. Format matters. She asked to review the documentation. I shared it securely. She asked a few clarifying questions, not about my feelings, but about sequence and context. Then she told me what would happen next. Not timelines, not promises. Process. And that's when the consequences began. Not visibly, but structurally. I was advised not to discuss the matter with anyone, to continue my role as usual, to document any further interactions normally. I agreed. From that point on, I was no longer managing the situation alone, and that changes how silence functions. Back at my desk, nothing looked different. People joked, meetings ran, deadlines existed. Daniel passed by once, nodded and smiled faintly. He had no idea the dynamic had shifted from interpersonal to institutional. That's the thing about systems, they don't announce themselves until they need to. Over the following weeks, subtle changes began to ripple outward. Daniel's calendar grew opaque. Meetings moved. Projects restructured. Decision paths altered without explanation. He wasn't removed, but he was being observed. He didn't know that yet. What he did know was that something felt off. He asked fewer questions, offered fewer comments. The private messages stopped entirely. Communication rerouted through formal channels. To anyone else, this would have looked like professional recalibration. To me, it was confirmation. I hadn't needed confrontation. I hadn't needed exposure. I hadn't even needed to speak beyond the facts. By moving in silence, by choosing process over performance, I allowed the situation to resolve on terms larger than either of us. And that's the quiet dominance people misunderstand. It's not about control over others. It's about control over your own response. The moment you stop needing recognition for doing the right thing becomes easier to do. By the time Daniel realized something irreversible was in motion, it was already out of his hands. And mine, consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They don't come with explanations or visible markers. They surface as absences, as delays, as subtle rearrangements that no one can quite account for, but everyone feels. That's how it began. Daniel wasn't removed from his role. There was no public reckoning, no whispered scandal. Instead, the environment around him started to change in ways that were difficult to challenge without drawing attention. Meetings he once led were suddenly co-hosted. Decisions he used to finalize independently now require additional review. Communication paths widened. More people copied. More documentation required. It looked like accountability. And accountability feels like friction when you're not used to it. I watched from my position, not with satisfaction, but with distance. I wasn't tracking outcomes anymore. I was simply present as the system did what systems do when enough information enters them. Daniel, on the other hand, became visibly unsettled, not panicked, not yet, but attentive in a way that bordered on anxious. He started checking policies mid-conversation, referencing guidelines that he never had before, asking questions about the process that used to bore him. That's when I understood something important. He didn't know what had been raised. He only knew that something had. And not knowing the scope is far more destabilizing than knowing the accusation. Around this time, I noticed a shift in how others interacted with him. Subtle, but real. Fewer private jokes, less casual deference. People listened more carefully to what he said and how he said it. No one told them to. That's how organizational awareness spreads, quietly, without labels. I wasn't included in any discussions about him. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't updated. And that was exactly as it should be. This was no longer my story to manage. What I did notice was how my own position changed, almost imperceptibly at first. I was looped back into early stage conversations, asked for input again, included in meetings where I'd been absent for months. No apology accompanied the shift. No acknowledgement, just a correction. That told me everything about how the situation was being interpreted internally. The issue wasn't me. It had been. Daniel attempted to re-establish contact once, A brief, carefully worded message asking if I had any concerns about recent changes. I replied with one line, "I'm focused on the current priorities." True, and sufficient. He didn't push further, because at this stage, pushing would have been visible, and visibility was the last thing he wanted. The irony is that if he had respected boundaries earlier, if he had accepted distance without trying to reclaim familiarity, none of this would have unfolded. But people who rely on blurred lines rarely recognize the moment when clarity becomes non-negotiable. As the weeks passed, the consequences deepened. Nothing dramatic, no forced exits, just structural constraints. Oversight, documentation, shared authority. For someone used to operating informally, it was suffocating. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was relief. Relief that the pressure I'd carried alone was now distributed appropriately. Relief that silence had done what confrontation never could. Most of all, the relief that I hadn't needed to compromise my values to protect myself. Quiet dominance isn't about watching someone fall. It's about watching the imbalance dissolve. And an imbalance doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes patiently, methodically, until what remains is simply proportion. Daniel eventually stopped trying to read my expressions, stopped scanning for cues, stopped attempting familiarity. The dynamic had changed irreversibly, not because I demanded it, but because I allowed truth to exist where it belonged. There's a moment in every unraveling where effort appears, not accountability, effort. That's when the person at the center realizes something is wrong, but still believes it can be managed, reframed, softened, reversed with the right tone and timing. That moment came for Daniel several weeks after the structural changes began. By then, and the atmosphere around him had shifted enough that he couldn't ignore it. Meetings felt heavier. Conversations felt guarded. The ease he once relied on had evaporated, replaced by formality and documentation. And for the first time, he was on the outside of the ambiguity. He asked to speak with me, not casually this time, not at my desk. A calendar invite, carefully phrased. Quick check-in. I accepted. When we sat down, his demeanor was different, slower, measured. He didn't lean in, didn't lower his voice. He stayed squarely in a professional posture. "I just wanted to make sure we're aligned," he said. "Things feel different lately." I let him speak. He talked about changes in the process, about increased oversight, about how certain dynamics seemed to have shifted. He framed it as confusion, not concern. That framing told me everything. He wasn't trying to understand what had happened. He was trying to restore what had been lost. At one point, he said, "If I've ever made you uncomfortable, that was never my intention." There it was, not an apology, not accountability. An attempt to close the gap without opening the record. I listened without reacting. Then I said calmly, "I've been focused on maintaining clear professional boundaries." That was it. No accusation, no detail, no reassurance. The silence that followed was different from any we'd shared before. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. He nodded slowly. "Of course," he said, "that's important." The meeting ended shortly after, and in that moment I knew it was too late. Not because I was unwilling to forgive, but because the system had already moved beyond personal resolution. Once the process begins, intent stops mattering. You can't retroactively align with boundaries you didn't respect when they were first implied. You can't restore trust by acknowledging discomfort only after consequences appear. Daniel wasn't a villain. He was a man who believed familiarity was harmless and only realized otherwise when it cost him influence. That's a common mistake. After that conversation, he stopped initiating contact entirely. Communication became strictly transactional. He deferred decisions more often, asked for confirmation in writing. He was careful now, but careful too late. Because care, once enforced externally, is no longer a choice. The changes around him continued. Reviews, oversight, adjustments that weren't punitive, but permanent. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Sadness. Not for him exactly, but for how avoidable it all had been. For how many small moments existed where respect could have reset the dynamic, if only it had been chosen voluntarily. But systems don't operate on regret. They operate on record. By this point, my role had stabilized. My visibility returned. My boundaries were unquestioned. and the weight I'd carried quietly for so long was gone. The situation didn't end with confrontation, it ended with containment. And that's often the most just outcome, not humiliation, not destruction, but limitation. Daniel never asked me outright what I'd done, and I never told him, because the point was never to make him know. The point was to make the behavior stop and ensure it couldn't quietly resume with someone else. By the time he understood that the situation was irreversible, the opportunity to fix it personally had long passed. And that's the truth most people don't like to face. Some things can't be repaired once they've been formally recognized. Not because people are unforgiving, but because clarity changes the rules. If you're expecting a dramatic confrontation, this isn't it. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no emotional release. In fact, by the time the final conversation happened, there was very little left to say. It took place months after the initial disclosure. By then, the system had finished its work. Roles had been adjusted, oversight normalized. The informal channels that once existed no longer exist. Daniel asked to speak with me one last time. Not officially, not privately in the old sense. A glass-walled meeting room, midday. Doors closed but visible. A neutral space. That choice mattered. He looked tired, not distressed, not angry. Just reduced. Less certain of his footing. Less expansive in his presence. "I wanted to clear the air," he said, "before we move forward." I nodded. He spoke carefully. About growth. About learning. About how leadership involves reflection. The language was polished, vetted, safe. At no point did he ask directly what had been raised. At no point did he deny anything. That told me this conversation wasn't about facts. It was about dignity. And I understood that. When he finished, he paused, as if waiting for me to balance the exchange, to reassure him that he wasn't a bad person, that things could return to something resembling ease. I didn't. Instead, I said, evenly, "I value working in an environment with clear professional boundaries." That was all. No elaboration, no summary, no absolution. He nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. And just like that, it was over. We didn't shake hands. We didn't exchange pleasantries. We simply stood and left the room. The confrontation, if it can be called that, contained no heat because heat wasn't necessary. The outcome had already been decided. What struck me afterward wasn't satisfaction, but alignment. There was no lingering anger, no sense of unfinished business. I hadn't needed to say everything I'd held in for a year, because saying it wouldn't have added truth. Truth was already present. This is something people misunderstand about resolution. They think it requires expression, catharsis, being heard emotionally. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes resolution comes from not needing to explain anymore, from knowing the record speaks more clearly than you ever could. Daniel and I continued to work in the same organization for some time after that, cordially, professionally, with distance, no tension, no familiarity, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. And I carried no desire to see him fail, no interest in recounting details to others, no need to claim victory, because this was never about winning. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own experience. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply leaves you standing where you belong, untouched, unburdened, and finally at peace with how you handled what could have easily gone another way. I didn't come out of that experience hardened. That's something people often assume, that when you go through something like this, you either become bitter or aggressive, more guarded or more confrontational. I didn't. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my definition of silence. Before, silence was something I slipped into out of habit, a way to keep things smooth, a way to avoid friction, a way to make myself easier to work with. Now, silence is intentional. It's a space I choose to occupy when clarity already exists, a boundary that doesn't need explanation, a pause that lets others reveal themselves without my interference. I'm still calm, still observant, still measured, but I'm no longer invisible to myself. At work, I speak when my input changes outcomes, not when it merely fills space. I document as a matter of course, not suspicion. I set expectations early, clearly, without apology. And when something feels misaligned, I don't wait for it to resolve itself. I name it factually, not with emotion, not with accusation, just enough to establish reality. What surprised me most was how little I had to give up to gain that clarity. I didn't sacrifice professionalism. I didn't lose credibility. I didn't burn bridges. If anything, my standing became more stable. People knew where I stood, not because I announced it, but because my behavior was consistent. Boundaries, once clear, tend to enforce themselves. I'm still underestimated by some. That doesn't bother me. Being underestimated is only dangerous when you underestimate yourself. I carry less now, less mental rehearsal, less self-doubt, less tolerance for quiet erosion. And I carry something else too, something subtle but durable. Trust in my own perception. I don't second-guess discomfort into silence anymore. I don't wait for proof to exist before I allow myself to notice a pattern. I trust myself to observe without panic and to act without spectacle. That's what this experience taught me. Not how to win, but how to remain intact. Because power isn't loud. It doesn't posture. It doesn't humiliate. It knows when to move and when not to. And most importantly, it knows that you don't need to be seen pushing back for the pushback to be real. I didn't emerge from this story with a scar I show people. I emerged with alignment between what I notice, what I allow, and what I do when those two diverge. That alignment is quiet, and it's enough. There's a version of this story that people often expect, one where anger fuels action, where justice is loud, where the ending feels like a victory because someone else is visibly diminished. That isn't this story. What happened to me didn't end with a dramatic reversal or a public reckoning. It ended with something quieter and far more lasting. It ended with self-respect restored. For a long time, I believed that staying calm meant staying silent, that endurance was a virtue in itself, that professionalism meant absorbing discomfort without naming it. What I learned instead is this: silence only protects you when it's chosen, not when it's inherited. The moment silence becomes a default, something you fall into because it feels safer, it stops being neutral. It starts to serve someone else's comfort at your expense. And here's the part that matters most. I didn't respond with aggression because aggression would have centered the conflict. I didn't respond with exposure because exposure would have centered the ego. I responded with process because process centers truth. Truth doesn't need decoration. It doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need to be punished to be effective. It only needs to be preserved accurately and placed where it belongs. People often ask why I didn't confront sooner, why I didn't just say something. Why did I wait? The answer is simple. I wasn't waiting to explode. I was waiting to understand. And once I did, I moved, not emotionally, but decisively. That's the moral I take from this. Not that everyone should stay silent, and not that everyone should escalate. But that's how you respond that matters more than how quickly you do. There's strength in refusing to mirror inappropriate behavior. There's power in documentation without obsession. And there's dignity in letting systems do what individuals can't fix alone. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about refusing to be rushed into a response that doesn't serve you. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: you don't owe anyone access to your comfort. You don't owe anyone emotional labor in exchange for professionalism. And you don't owe the world a dramatic reaction to justify your boundaries. Sometimes the most decisive response is the one that leaves no room for denial and no need for noise. I shared this story not to instruct, but to offer perspective. Because many people live in situations like this longer than they should, simply because nothing obviously wrong seems to be happening. But discomfort doesn't need to be extreme to be valid, and clarity, once achieved, is always worth honoring. So I'll leave you with a question, not rhetorical, but genuine. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough to realize your silence wasn't weakness, but preparation? And what did you do once you understood that? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.